August 8, 1944. The edge of Del de la Roquewood, near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil, Normandy. 21-year-old trooper Joe Ekins sat in the gunner's position of Sherman Firefly Velikier Luki, staring through his telescopic sight at an open field. His hands were steady on the controls, but his mind raced with doubt. Inside the turret of this modified American tank, surrounded by ready ammunition racks, he faced a decision that would alter the course of armored warfare history. The standard armor-piercing shell was already loaded in the breech. Behind him, secured in their storage bins, sat the newer, more powerful discarding sabot rounds that everyone said could penetrate any German armor. But in this moment, 800 yards from 3 advancing Tiger tanks, Joe Ekins made a choice that would prove the difference between theoretical superiority and practical effectiveness. He kept the standard round chambered. What happened next would not just destroy the most feared tank ace in the German army. It would demonstrate that sometimes the perfect weapon isn't the newest technology, but the reliable tool that delivers when it matters most. 3 Tiger tanks, each weighing nearly 70 tons, were advancing toward his position. Behind him waited ammunition that could theoretically penetrate even thicker armor. But Joe Ekins understood something ammunition designers had not fully grasped. Superior penetration meant nothing if you couldn't hit what you aimed at. The story of how one gunner's choice of standard ammunition over revolutionary technology destroyed 3 Tigers in 12 minutes begins with the British arms industry's desperate race to create a tank gun that could stop German heavy armor. By 1942 in North Africa, British tankers found their guns inadequate against German armor. The 2-pounder and 6-pounder guns couldn't penetrate newer German tanks at combat ranges. American-made Lee and Grant tanks with 75mm guns provided temporary relief, but British planners knew they needed something more powerful. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun, designed in 1941 for tank use, was a 76.2mm weapon with exceptional power. It could defeat armor ranging from 120 to 208mm thick at 1,000 meters. The gun proved itself in Tunisia in February 1943, devastating German armor at ranges that shocked panzer commanders. But mounting this weapon in a tank turret seemed impossible. The gun's recoil travelled 40 inches backwards when fired, too much for any British tank turret. The breech was enormous, and ammunition was much longer than standard British rounds. The Churchill and Cromwell tanks couldn't accommodate it. British designers had created their most powerful anti-tank gun with no tank to mount it in. Major George Brighty and Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge saw potential in the M4 Sherman tanks Britain received through Lend-Lease. The Sherman's large turret might accommodate the 17-pounder. The Ministry of Supply initially rejected this idea. Using American tanks seemed like admitting Britain couldn't produce adequate armor. But Brighty and Witheridge conducted unauthorized trials at Lulworth Gunnery School, bootlegging a prototype through determination and improvisation. When discovered, instead of facing court-martial, their project was handed to professional developers. W.G.K. Kilburn transformed their crude prototype into a production weapons system. Kilburn redesigned the recoil system, placing shortened cylinders on both sides of the gun. He rotated the breech 90 degrees for side loading. The radio was moved to a welded bustle on the turret rear. A new gunner's hatch improved crew escape. The bow gunner was eliminated to create ammunition storage space. By October 1943, orders for 2,100 Fireflies were placed before testing was complete. The Challenger program faced delays, and few would be ready for Normandy. From D-Day through August, almost 400 Fireflies were converted. Each represented complete rethinking of how to integrate an oversized weapon into an inadequate platform. The Firefly's main armament, the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder Mark IV, was a specialized variant of the gun modified specifically for tank use. It featured a horizontal sliding breech instead of the vertical sliding breech used on towed anti-tank guns, making loading in the confined space of a turret actually possible. The recoil system was completely redesigned from the towed version. New mounts and trunnions were developed to handle the stress of firing from a moving platform rather than a stable ground mounting. The gun could fire several types of ammunition, each with different characteristics and purposes. The standard anti-tank round was armor-piercing capped ballistic capped, abbreviated APCBC. This 17-pound steel projectile could penetrate 163 mm at 500 meters and 150 mm at 1,000 meters. Against side armor at closer ranges, penetration exceeded these figures significantly, but the Firefly's supposed ace in the hole was newer ammunition that had begun reaching Normandy in limited quantities by late June or early July 1944. Armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition, abbreviated APDS, represented a revolutionary approach to armor penetration. Instead of accelerating a full 17-pound projectile, APDS used a much smaller tungsten carbide penetrator core, weighing only 7.7 pounds. This penetrator was encased in a lightweight aluminum sabot, a sleeve that made the projectile fit the gun barrel. When the round was fired, the sabot fell away after leaving the barrel, and only the small, dense tungsten core continued toward the target. The lighter projectile could be accelerated to much higher velocities. While APCBC rounds left the muzzle at approximately 2,900 feet per second, APDS rounds achieved 3,950 feet per second, nearly 900 feet per second faster. This translated into dramatically increased penetration. On paper, APDS could penetrate 256 millimeters of armor at 500 meters and 233 millimeters at 1,000 meters. These numbers meant APDS could theoretically defeat the frontal armor of even the King Tiger, the most heavily armored production tank of World War II, which didn't appear in combat until late 1944. Military planners looked at these penetration figures and saw the ultimate solution to German heavy armor. Firefly crews were issued small quantities of APDS rounds for their most difficult engagements. Against Tigers and Panthers, against the heavy armor that had terrorized British tank formations since their first encounters in North Africa, this super-velocity ammunition would supposedly be the answer. The theoretical advantages were overwhelming. Higher velocity meant flatter trajectory and less need to adjust for range. Higher velocity meant greater kinetic energy on impact. The tungsten penetrator could defeat armor that would stop APCBC rounds. On ammunition specification sheets and in testing facilities, APDS looked like the perfect anti-tank round. But there were problems that didn't show up on those specification sheets. Problems that would only become apparent in actual combat conditions. APDS rounds suffered from severe accuracy problems beyond 500 yards. The smaller tungsten core, once separated from its sabot, was more susceptible to crosswinds than the heavier full-caliber APCBC projectile. Minor imperfections in the barrel that barely affected APCBC accuracy caused APDS rounds to veer unpredictably. More critically, British gunners quickly discovered that firing APDS rounds often damaged their own guns. Fragments of the discarding sabot sometimes clipped the muzzle brake as they separated from the penetrator. This damage, even if minor, negatively impacted the accuracy of all subsequent shots, including standard APCBC ammunition. A gunner who fired APDS and damaged his muzzle brake might find that his previously accurate gun now shot unpredictably, potentially costing him his life in subsequent engagements. British testing in late July and early August 1944 revealed these accuracy issues, but the limited availability of APDS rounds made comprehensive investigation difficult. The sabot separation problem wasn't fully understood until late August, after it had already affected numerous combat engagements. Even when the problems were identified, solving them would require redesigning the muzzle brake, a modification that couldn't be implemented quickly on tanks already in the field. There was another problem that ammunition designers hadn't fully appreciated until combat reports started coming back from Normandy. The smaller tungsten penetrator of APDS, even when it successfully penetrated enemy armor, caused less internal damage than the full-caliber APCBC shell. The APCBC round delivered a full 17-pound projectile, still carrying tremendous kinetic energy, into the interior of an enemy tank. Even though the bursting charge was tiny, only about 0.2% of the projectile's weight by late in the war, the combination of the large projectile mass and the small explosive charge wreaked havoc on crew and internal components. Fragments from the penetration itself, combined with the explosive bursting charge, created a devastating shower of metal inside the target tank. Fuel tanks ruptured, ammunition ignited. Crew members were killed or incapacitated. APDS penetrations were cleaner. The small tungsten penetrator, while incredibly effective at piercing armor, carried less total kinetic energy than the full-caliber APCBC round. It might pass entirely through a tank without hitting critical components, leaving a neat hole through both sides of the armor without necessarily disabling the vehicle. British tank commanders discovered that they might need multiple APDS hits to ensure a kill, while a single well-placed APCBC shot that penetrated often caused catastrophic damage. The tungsten core had a tendency to tumble and fragment after penetrating, which sometimes caused extensive damage, but this was unpredictable. An APCBC hit that penetrated was almost always immediately effective. These problems created a serious dilemma for Firefly gunners facing German heavy armor. APCBC ammunition was standard, reliable, and available. Every Firefly carried plenty of it. Gunners had trained extensively with APCBC and understood its ballistics intimately, but APDS could penetrate thicker armor, at least in theory. For a gunner facing a Tiger tank at medium range, which round should he choose? The answer wasn't straightforward. It depended on range, target aspect, angle of impact, and perhaps most critically, the gunner's confidence in his own shooting ability. At ranges under 800 yards, where even a first-time gunner could reasonably expect to hit what he aimed at, APCBC could penetrate the side and rear armor of any German tank in service. The Tiger's side armor was only 80 millimeters thick. The Panther's side armor was even thinner, just 40 to 50 millimeters depending on location. APCBC could defeat these thicknesses easily at combat ranges. Only if a tank presented its heavily armored front at oblique angles did APDS's superior penetration become necessary. But at longer ranges, where accuracy became critical and where APDS's velocity advantage should have provided flatter trajectory and easier aiming, the unpredictable flight characteristics of sabot rounds made them a gamble. This was the tactical and technical situation Joe Ekins found himself facing on the morning of August 8, 1944. Operation Totalize, a massive Canadian-led offensive to break through German lines south of Caen and trap retreating German forces, had begun the previous evening with heavy bomber strikes and a night advance by armoured columns. The 1st Canadian Army, supported by British armoured formations, was pushing south toward the town of Falaise. If they could capture the high ground around Falaise and link up with American forces pushing north, they would trap thousands of German soldiers in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. The 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, part of the 33rd Armoured Brigade and the 7th Armoured Division, advanced during the night of August 7th and reached the French village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cramasnil in the early morning hours of August 8th. The Yeomanry, nicknamed the Northants, was a cavalry regiment that had converted to tanks. They retained their cavalry traditions and their cavalry organization of squadrons and troops rather than companies and platoons. B Squadron remained in and around the village to provide security and establish a defensive position. A squadron and C Squadron received orders to push further south to Del de la Roque Wood, approximately 1 kilometre south of Saint-Aignan. The wood was strategically valuable, sitting on slightly elevated ground that commanded views of the surrounding farmland. More importantly, the tree line provided excellent concealment for tanks that could cover the open fields to the south and east. C Squadron moved to the east side of the wood, positioning themselves to cover approaches from that direction. A squadron, which was significantly under strength due to losses sustained in earlier fighting, took positions in the southern portion of the wood. Number 3, Troop of a Squadron, one of the smallest tactical units in British armoured organisation, occupied positions on the sledoed western edge of the tree line. From their position, Joe Ekins and the crew of the Sherman Firefly Velikie Luki could overlook a large section of open ground stretching southeast toward the village of Sintio, approximately 1,500 meters away. The field was relatively flat farmland, typical of the Normandy countryside. There was no cover for advancing vehicles, no folds in the ground where tanks could hide, nothing but open space where anything moving would be immediately visible. It was perfect defensive terrain, the kind of killing ground that tankers dreamed about, where concealed defenders could engage advancing enemies at ranges of their choosing. The name Velikie Luki, meaning great bows in Russian, came from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry's practice of naming A squadron tanks after Soviet cities. Number 3 troops specifically used names beginning with V. Other tanks in the troop were named Vostok, Vladivostok, and Vitebsk. This naming convention helped with radio communication and unit organization. The crew of Velikie Luki consisted of 4 men, reduced from the standard Sherman crew of 5 because there simply wasn't room for a bow gunner when 17-pounder ammunition took up the space where he normally would have Saturday. Sergeant Douglas Gordon commanded the tank, positioned in the turret above and behind the gunner with the best view of the battlefield through his vision blocks and cupola. Trooper Joe Ekins served as gunner, responsible for aiming and firing the 17-pounder gun. His position gave him a magnified telescopic view of the battlefield, but his vision was limited to whatever appeared in his sight picture. He depended on Gordon to identify targets and give fire orders. The loader position was typically occupied by whoever could best handle the physical demands of loading the heavy 17-pounder ammunition. The radio operator, who also served as assistant loader when needed, sat lower in the hull. The driver, positioned in the front left of the hull, could barely see anything when the tank was buttoned up with all hatches closed, relying on his commander's instructions for navigation. At approximately noon on August 8th, the German counterattack developed. 7 Tiger tanks from the 3rd Company and Headquarters Company of the 101st SS Heavy Tank Battalion, supported by Panzer IV medium tanks and Stug 4 assault guns, advanced north up Route Nationale 158 from Sintio. Their objective was to recapture the high ground around Saint-Agnan, push the British back, and disrupt Operation Totalize before it could achieve its breakthrough. The Germans knew that if the Allies secured this area and continued their advance, German forces further west would be trapped and destroyed. This counterattack wasn't just tactically important, it was strategically critical to preventing the collapse of the entire German position in Normandy. Leading this counterattack was SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding Tiger number 007. Michael Wittmann was already legendary within the Wehrmacht and among Allied intelligence officers who tracked German armor aces. He was credited with 138 Allied tanks destroyed and 132 anti-tank guns knocked out, making him one of the most successful tank commanders in history. His most famous action had occurred less than 2 months earlier on June 13th near Villers-Bocage, where in less than 15 minutes he had single-handedly destroyed 14 British tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns, stopping a British breakthrough attempt cold. Nazi propaganda had elevated Wittmann to hero status, using his image to bolster German morale and intimidate Allied forces. His Tiger tank represented the pinnacle of German armoured warfare, supposedly invincible, crewed by an elite Waffen-SS commander whose skill and experience far exceeded that of average Allied tankers. But Wittmann's situation on August 8th was far from ideal. He had only taken command of Tiger 007 about a month earlier when he assumed command of 2nd Company. The tank had seen continuous combat, and while German crews were meticulous about maintenance when circumstances permitted, the realities of combat operations and difficulties in supplying spare parts meant even Tigers weren't operating at peak mechanical efficiency. More critically, Wittmann was attacking across open ground toward an enemy position he hadn't properly reconnoitred. Time pressure from the broader German counterattack, combined with the urgent need to recapture Saint-Agnan before Allied forces could consolidate their positions, had forced him to attack before conducting proper reconnaissance. He was advancing into unknown terrain against an enemy of unknown strength in unknown positions. violating several fundamental principles of armored warfare. But the strategic situation demanded immediate action, and Whitman had built his reputation on aggressive action and decisive leadership. He led from the front, as SS officers were expected to do. From his position at the edge of Del de la Roque Wood, Joe Ekins watched the German armour advance across the open field. Through his telescopic gunner's sight, he could see 3 Tigers clearly moving up the road from Sintio. The other German tanks mentioned in various accounts were either obscured by terrain, positioned outside his limited field of view through the gun sight, or were the supporting Panzer IVs and assault guns that accompanied the Tiger spearhead. The Tigers themselves were unmistakable, massive machines that dwarfed the Shermans and even the Firefly. Each Tiger weighed nearly 70 tons compared to the Firefly's 35 tons. Their 88mm guns were visible even at 800 yards, long barrels that could destroy a Sherman at ranges well, beyond effective return fire with standard American 75mm guns. The Tigers moved in a loose formation, not bunched together where a single shot might damage multiple vehicles, but close enough to provide mutual support. They were advancing steadily but not quickly, perhaps 20 kilometers per hour, the cautious pace of experienced tankers moving through potentially dangerous terrain. Lieutenant James, commanding No. 3 Troop, made the critical tactical decision to hold fire. Allowing the Tigers to close the distance would increase the probability of first-round hits dramatically. At 1,500 meters, even the Firefly's powerful gun required precise range estimation and careful aim. At 800 meters, hitting a tank-sized target became much more achievable, even for a gunner in his first combat engagement. The Tigers continued advancing, their crews apparently unaware that they were moving into a carefully prepared ambush. The advantage of terrain and surprise belonged entirely to the British. The Tigers were silhouetted against the open field, clearly visible to concealed observers. The Fireflies sat in shadow under trees, their positions chosen specifically to maximize concealment while maintaining clear fields of fire. Joe Ekins had never fired his gun in combat before this moment. He was 21 years old, a former shoe factory worker from Rushden who had volunteered for the army in 1942. His training had been thorough by wartime standards, but abbreviated compared to peacetime professional soldiers. He had trained on the Firefly for only a few weeks before being assigned to 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry. He had fired exactly 5 practice rounds with the 17-pounder, enough to understand the basics of aiming and firing, but hardly enough to make him an expert marksman. Yet here he sat, preparing to engage 3 of the most powerful tanks in the German arsenal, tanks that veteran crews with years of combat experience had learned to fear and respect. Inside the Firefly's turret, conditions were already uncomfortable despite the relatively cool August morning. The confined space trapped heat from the crew's bodies and from the engine compartment behind them. The air smelled of gun oil, cordite residue from earlier firing, and the distinctive metallic smell of the tank's interior. Visibility was severely limited. Ekins could see only what appeared in his gunner's telescope, a narrow, magnified view of the battlefield. Gordon could see more through his commander's cupola, but even his view was restricted by the vision blocks. The loader and radio operator could see almost nothing, depending entirely on intercom communications to understand what was happening outside their steel box. The ammunition racks beside Ekins held both types of 17-pounder ammunition within reach. The APCBC rounds, with their distinctive tapered shape and ballistic cap, were arranged for quick access. The rarer APDS rounds were stored separately in their bins. Standard procedure called for loading APCBC for the first round, unless specifically ordered otherwise, and Ekins had already loaded a standard armor-piercing round into the breech. This choice would prove more important than anyone in that turret could have known. The decision to use APCBC instead of the theoretically superior APDS wasn't made through careful analysis of ammunition performance characteristics. Ekins simply loaded what he had trained with, what he knew would fly predictably, what he had confidence in. At 800 yards, against targets presenting their flanks as they advanced up the road, the standard ammunition would penetrate easily if he could hit the target. APDS might penetrate thicker armor, but at this range, Against side armor only 80 millimeters thick, penetration wasn't the problem. Accuracy was everything. A miss with APDS was no better than a miss with APCBC, and the unpredictable trajectory of sabot rounds made misses more likely. More importantly, APCBC rounds flew where they were aimed. Ekins had trained with APCBC ammunition. He understood its trajectory, knew where it would impact relative to his point of aim, had developed the muscle memory for aiming and firing with that specific ammunition type. APDS was still relatively new to British tank crews, issued only in small quantities, with limited opportunity for practice. For a gunner in his first combat engagement, reliability and familiarity mattered more than theoretical maximum penetration capability. Lieutenant James's voice came through the intercom. The Tigers were within 800 yards, well within effective range, presenting their flanks as they continued their advance. The moment for action had arrived. James issued the fire order, designating targets for the Fireflies in his troop. Standard British tank doctrine called for engaging multiple targets simultaneously when possible, rather than concentrating fire on a single target. With 3 Tigers visible and multiple Fireflies available, James assigned 1 Tiger to each tank. Joe Ekins received orders to engage the rearmost Tiger of the 3 he could see. The tactical logic was sound. If the lead Tiger was hit first, the following tanks might scatter or retreat before they could be engaged. By hitting the rear Tiger first, the others might not immediately realize they were under attack, giving the British gunners precious extra seconds to reload and fire again. Ekins's training took over. Center the target in the sight. Estimate the range, 800 yards, well within the range where 17-pounder ballistics were essentially flat trajectory. Aim for center mass of the target, the largest part where even slight aiming errors would still result in hits. Lead the target slightly to account for its forward movement and the projectile's flight time. Take a breath, let it out slowly to steady the aim. Squeeze the saging. Trigger smoothly without jerking. The 17-pounder fired with a tremendous concussion that shook the entire tank. The recoil system absorbed most of the force, but crew members still felt the shock. The muzzle blast kicked up a massive cloud of dust and smoke from the ground in front of the Firefly's position, temporarily obscuring visibility. Through the smoke and dust, Ekins caught a glimpse of Tracer from his round arcing toward the target, the red glow visible even in daylight. The flight time at 800 yards was barely over a second, not enough time for the Tiger to react even if its crew spotted the muzzle flash. His first combat shot flew true. The armor-piercing ballistic capped round struck the rearmost Tiger on the right side, just above the road wheels where the hull side armor was perpendicular to the incoming projectile. At 800 yards, the APCBC round retained nearly all its muzzle velocity, approaching 3,000 feet per second on Baco. Impact. The 17-pound steel projectile, hardened to penetrate armor and capped to prevent shattering, punched through the Tiger's 80mm side armor as easily as a rifle bullet through sheet metal. What happened inside that Tiger hull was catastrophic. The APCBC round penetrated the armor and entered the crew compartment with tremendous energy. The projectile itself acted like a huge bullet, tumbling and fragmenting as it encountered internal components. The small bursting charge detonated, though its explosive contribution was minor compared to the kinetic energy effects. More importantly, the penetration created a shower of armor fragments on the interior face of the armor plate, razor-sharp metal shards moving at high velocity. These fragments, combined with the penetrating projectile, created a devastating spray of metal inside the confined space. The Tiger's interior was packed with ammunition. German tanks stored ammunition in bins along the hull sides and in promid racks throughout the fighting compartment, placing ready ammunition within easy reach of the loader, but also creating numerous potential ignition points if the tank was penetrated. The penetrating APCBC round struck stored ammunition, and the Tiger exploded. The ammunition detonation was far more powerful than the bursting charge in the penetrating round itself. High explosive propellant charges ignited sympathetically, one after another in a cascading explosion. The pressure inside the sealed tank rose instantly to catastrophic levels. The weakest point of the tank's structure, the turret ring where the turret attached to the hull, gave way. The turret, weighing over 11 tons, was blown completely off the hull by the force of the internal explosion. It landed several meters away from the burning hull, a testament to the violence of the ammunition detonation. The crew had no chance to escape. The initial penetration and the immediate ammunition explosion killed everyone inside, within seconds. The other two Tigers that No. 3 Troop could observe immediately began evasive maneuvers, but they were still 800 yards away and had already entered the kill zone. Tank training emphasized immediate action when coming under fire. Button up all hatches, begin evasive movement, identify the threat, return fire if possible. But these actions took time, and time was something the German crews didn't have. One Tiger fired toward the tree line where it had seen the muzzle flash, and the round struck near Sergeant Gordon's Firefly. The shell hit the turret but didn't penetrate. The Tiger's 88mm gun was powerful, but at 800 yards against a target in partial cover with only the turret exposed, scoring a killing hit wasn't guaranteed. The round did hit close enough to cause fragments that wounded Sergeant Gordon, forcing him to bail out of the tank. This left the Firefly technically without a commander, but the British training system emphasized cross-training. Every crew member knew the basics of every other crew member's job. The gunner could take over if the commander was killed. The loader could gun if necessary. The radio operator could load. With Gordon wounded and evacuating, the crew continued functioning even though they'd lost their commander. Lieutenant James, the troop commander, made an immediate decision. The Firefly was the only tank in the troop capable of reliably engaging Tigers at this range. The standard Shermans with 75mm guns could certainly try, but their armor-piercing ammunition was unlikely to penetrate Tiger armor at 800 yards even from the side. The Firefly had to stay in action. James left his own tank and ran through German fire to reach Gordon's Firefly, clambering up onto the turret and dropping through the commander's hatch. He took command of the gun and crew, bringing officer leadership and battlefield awareness to replace the wounded Gordon. James's first order was to reposition. British tank doctrine emphasized shoot and move, never firing from the same position twice if it could be avoided. A well-trained crew identified alternate firing positions whenever they occupied a new defensive area, places they could move to quickly that offered different angles of fire and forced the enemy to reacquire them. Without waiting for additional orders, Eakins and the crew had already begun preparing for the next engagement. Another APCBC round was loaded into the breech. The second Tiger, which had been attempting to turn to present its heavier frontal armor toward the threat, caught the next 17-pounder round in its flank before it could complete the maneuver. The range was still approximately 800 yards, the same conditions as the first shot. Eakins followed the same procedure. Center the target, aim for center mass, lead slightly for movement, squeeze the trigger smoothly. The gun fired again with the same tremendous concussion. The APCBC round struck the Tiger near the turret ring, a particularly vulnerable area where the thick turret armor met the thinner hull armor. The projectile penetrated, and while this Tiger didn't suffer an immediate catastrophic ammunition explosion like the first, the internal damage was devastating. Fire broke out in the crew compartment. Whether from ruptured fuel lines, ignited ammunition propellant, or other sources, fire inside a tank was a death sentence if the crew couldn't evacuate immediately. This Tiger's crew began bailing out, but the fire spread so quickly that at least some crew members didn't escape. The tank was mission killed, unable to fight, burning fiercely. The third Tiger, having watched two companions destroyed in less than a minute, sought cover behind a slight rise in the terrain. This was trained German doctrine under ambush. If you're taking fire from an unknown position, get to cover immediately, reassess the situation, then counterattack from a position of advantage. The Tiger backed down behind the terrain feature, presenting only portions of its turret and upper hull. This was exactly the situation where APDS ammunition's superior penetration should have been advantageous. The Tiger was now partially hull down, presenting a smaller target, and what was visible was angled toward the Firefly. In theory, this called for switching to the more powerful sabot ammunition. But Ekins didn't switch ammunition types. The gun was shooting true. The rhythm of load, aim, fire was working perfectly. Thompson's loading was smooth and quick. Changing ammunition types now would break that rhythm, introduce an unfamiliar variable, require different aiming techniques to compensate for APDS's different trajectory. More critically, Ekins had identified his aiming point. He wasn't going to attempt a frontal penetration through the Tiger's thickest armor. Even partially hull down, enough of the turret side was visible that he could aim for a flanking shot rather than a frontal engagement. The third Tiger was traversing its turret, trying to locate and engage the Firefly that had destroyed two of its companions. German Tiger crews were well trained and experienced, but locating a concealed target was difficult even for experts, especially when working from partial cover and under the stress of knowing two other Tigers had just been destroyed. Ekins fired first. His third APCBC round struck the Tiger's turret side near the junction between turret and hull. This was a difficult shot, requiring precision aiming at a partially concealed target. But at 800 yards with a gun that was shooting consistently, Ekins had developed confidence in his aim. The round struck home, penetrating the turret side armor. The Tiger's interior erupted in flames. Like the first Tiger, this one suffered an ammunition explosion, though not quite as catastrophic. The turret shifted violently on its ring, but didn't completely, separate from the hull. The crew had no opportunity to evacuate before the fire consumed the tank. Within 12 minutes of opening fire, Joe Ekins had destroyed 3 Tiger tanks using 3 shots of standard armor-piercing ammunition. It was an extraordinary feat of gunnery, made more remarkable by the fact that this was his first combat engagement, and he had fired his gun only 5 times in training before this morning. The engagement demonstrated something profound about the relationship between ammunition performance and combat effectiveness. The APDS rounds stored in Velikiye Luki's ammunition bins had superior penetration characteristics on paper. They could defeat thicker armor at steeper angles. But in this specific tactical situation, APCBC was the perfect ammunition choice. The standard rounds flew accurately, allowing Ekins to make rapid adjustments after his first shot based on where it impacted. The full-caliber projectiles carried tremendous kinetic energy into the target, maximizing internal damage and increasing the likelihood of catastrophic kills. The lack of sabot separation meant no risk of muzzle brake damage that might affect accuracy on subsequent shots. Most importantly, Ekins had trained with APCBC and understood its ballistics intimately. Familiarity breeds accuracy, and in tank combat where the first accurate hit often determines survival, familiarity was more valuable than theoretical superiority. If Ekins had loaded APDS for his first shot, the engagement might have ended very differently. The sabot round might have missed due to its unpredictable trajectory. Even if it hit and penetrated, it might not have caused sufficient internal damage to ensure an immediate kill, allowing the Tiger crew to return fire. The muzzle brake might have been damaged by sabot fragments, throwing off subsequent shots. The precious seconds spent evaluating which ammunition to use might have given the Tigers time to spot the Firefly and destroy it with their first shot. By using what he knew, what he'd trained with, what would reliably hit the target, Ekins made the tactically correct decision even though it appeared to contradict the theoretical superiority of the newer ammunition. The engagement wasn't finished. Shortly after Ekins destroyed the 3 Tigers, the main German counterattack developed towards C Squadron's position on the eastern side of Del de la Roquewood. Additional German armor, including the other Tigers from the 7-tank formation and supporting Panzer IVs, pressed the attack despite the loss of 3 Tigers in the opening minutes. A squadron moved to support C Squadron, minus Sergeant Gordon's Firefly, which now had Lieutenant James commanding it. In the resulting combat, Ekins engaged and destroyed a Panzer IV medium tank, demonstrating that the Firefly's 17-pounder was effective against all classes of German armor, not just the heavy tanks. But his tank was then hit by return fire, and, damaged severely enough that the crew was forced to bail out. By that point, however, the German counterattack had been decisively broken. The loss of 3 Tigers in the opening engagement had shattered the momentum of the advance. German tank commanders realized they were attacking into a trap where British tanks with guns capable of defeating Tigers at medium to long range were waiting in concealed positions. Without armor superiority, without the element of surprise, and without the advantage of terrain, continuing the attack would simply result in additional losses for no gain. The Tigers that Joe Ekins destroyed were later identified through investigation of the battlefield and examination of German records. Their turret numbers were 312007 and 314. These specific identification numbers were recorded in the regimental war diary of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry on August 8, 1944, providing documentary evidence of the engagement. Tank number 007 was Michael Wittmann's command tank. The death of Nazi Germany's most famous tank ace, killed in his first engagement since taking command of 2nd Company, killed by a 21-year-old gunner in his very first combat engagement, killed using standard ammunition rather than the supposedly superior new Sabot rounds, became one of the most analysed actions of the entire Normandy campaign. For decades after the war, controversy surrounded the question of who actually destroyed Wittmann's tank. Various units claimed credit for killing the famous German ace. The 1st Polish Armoured Division, operating in the same general area, claimed responsibility. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division suggested their tanks might have engaged Wittmann. The 144th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps believed they might have been responsible. The 2nd Tactical Air Force claimed rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft might have destroyed Wittmann's Tiger. Even German officers initially couldn't believe an Allied tank had killed Wittmann, attributing his death to naval artillery, because accepting that a Sherman variant could destroy the Tiger ace seemed psychologically impossible. Wittmann's body and those of his crew weren't discovered until 1983, when the German War Graves Commission conducted excavations during road construction near Gomes-Nil. The discovery of the remains, buried near the wreckage of Tank 007, prompted renewed investigation into the circumstances of his death. In 1985, the British military history magazine After the Battle published a detailed investigation of Wittmann's final action. Les Taylor, a wartime member of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry who had witnessed the engagement, publicly stated that Joe Ekins was responsible for destroying Wittmann's tank. Ken Toot, another yeomanry veteran who had served in C Squadron and later became a military historian, published similar accounts crediting Ekins with the kill. The physical evidence supported this conclusion. The position of the destroyed Tigers, all within the field of fire from the western edge of Del de la Roque Wood, matched No. 3 Troops' position. The timing of the engagement, beginning at approximately 12:47 on August 8th, matched the recorded start time in the Yeomanry War Diary. The turret numbers of the destroyed Tigers, recorded immediately after the battle, matched the 3 tanks Ekins reported engaging. Tank 007, Wittmann's Tiger, was identified as the rearmost of the 3 Tigers destroyed, exactly matching Ekins's account of engaging the rear tank first, as ordered by Lieutenant James. Historian Brian Reed later proposed an alternative theory, suggesting that Sherman Fireflies from a squadron of the Canadian Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, positioned on the left flank of the advancing Tigers, might have been responsible for destroying Wittmann instead. Reed's theory gained some attention, particularly in Canada, but it had significant evidentiary problems. Reed claimed 5 Tigers were in the field when multiple eyewitness accounts and the Yeomanry War Diary mentioned only 3 Tigers visible to No. 3 Troop. He repositioned Tank 007 from its documented position in the centre-right of the advance to a position near a chateau on the left, contradicting physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. The Northamptonshire Yeomanry War Diary made no mention of Canadian tanks engaging in this specific action, despite the fact that a squadron's position overlooked the area where Reed claimed the Canadians were located. Most significantly, Reed offered no documentary evidence from Canadian sources to support his claim, relying instead on theoretical possibility rather than documented fact. The consensus among military historians remains that Joe Ekins, firing from Sherman Firefly Velikie Luki at the Pete, western edge of Del de la Roque Wood, destroyed 3 Tigers, including Michael Whitman's tank number 007, using standard APCBC ammunition at a range of approximately 800 yards. The engagement stands as one of the most remarkable examples of how practical effectiveness trumps theoretical superiority in combat. APDS ammunition, with its superior penetration characteristics, was theoretically the better choice for engaging heavily armoured targets. But its accuracy problems, unpredictable terminal effects, and the risk of damaging the gun that fired it made APCBC the tactically superior choice in this specific engagement. Ekins's decision to use standard ammunition, whether made consciously or simply through following training and using what he knew would work, proved to be exactly right. The lessons from Saint-Aignan de Cramsnil influenced British and Canadian ammunition doctrine for the remainder of the war. APDS remained in Firefly ammunition loadouts, typically comprising about 6% of total ammunition carried, reserved for specific situations where its penetration was genuinely necessary. But APCBC was recognized as the primary anti-tank round for the vast majority of combat engagements. Firefly crews received training emphasizing that the newest ammunition wasn't automatically the best ammunition, that tactical situations determined optimal ammunition selection, and that familiarity and reliability often mattered more than maximum theoretical performance. The Firefly itself became the most feared Allied tank from the German perspective during the Normandy campaign and beyond. Panzer crews learned quickly to identify Fireflies by their longer barrels and prioritize them as targets. British crews responded by attempting to camouflage the distinctive 17-pounder barrel, painting it to resemble a standard 75mm gun or wrapping it in camouflage netting to break up its outline. German tactical instructions specifically warned about the Firefly's ability to penetrate Tiger and Panther armor at ranges where those vehicles had previously been safe from Allied tank guns. The psychological impact was profound. German tankers who had grown accustomed to armor superiority, who had dominated Allied armor through most of 1944, suddenly faced a weapon that could kill them at medium to long ranges. The myth of Tiger invincibility died in that wheat field near Sinto on August 8, 1944. Between D-Day and the end of the Normandy campaign in late August, Fireflies destroyed substantial numbers of German heavy tanks. Exact numbers remain disputed because battlefield identification was difficult in the chaos of combat. Destroyed tanks often weren't examined closely, and multiple tanks sometimes engaged the same target, making attribution uncertain. But British and Canadian after-action reports credited Fireflies with destroying Panthers and Tigers far out of proportion to their numerical representation in armoured formations. A single Firefly per troop, one specialised tank among 4 total, provided British and Canadian armoured units with the capability to engage German heavy armour on roughly equal terms for the first time since Tigers and Panthers had appeared. Joe Ekins was reassigned within a squadron after his Firefly was knocked out on August 8th. He served as a radio operator in another tank for the remainder of the war, never returning to the gunner's position. After the war ended in May 1945, he returned to Rushden and resumed work in the shoe factories near his hometown. He eventually rose to become a manager, working in the same industry for 34 years until retirement. He married the woman he had met during his training period. Ekins rarely spoke about his wartime service for decades. The destruction of 3 Tigers, including the tank of Germany's most famous ace, simply wasn't something he felt comfortable discussing. Only after the 1985, after the battle investigation publicly identified him as Whitman's probable killer, did Ekins begin to receive recognition for his actions. In interviews conducted late in his life, Ekins repeatedly expressed disbelief at what he had accomplished that morning. He couldn't reconcile the doctrine he'd been taught, that it took 5 Shermans to engage 1 Tiger with any hope of success, with the reality that he had destroyed 3 Tigers in 12 minutes in his first combat engagement. When asked about his ammunition choice, he explained simply that he had used what he'd trained with, what he knew would hit the target where he aimed. The theoretical superiority of APDS ammunition hadn't entered his thinking in the moment. What mattered was making that first shot count, hitting the target accurately, then following up before the Tigers could react and return fire. Ekins died on February 1, 2012, at age 88. His obituaries finally gave full public recognition to a man whose actions on one August morning in 1944 had changed armoured warfare's trajectory. Military historians continue to study the engagement as a case study in how practical effectiveness trumps theoretical capability, how familiarity and reliability often matter more than raw performance statistics, and how individual decisions made under extreme stress can alter the outcomes of battles. The story of Joe Ekins and his choice of standard ammunition over theoretically superior sabot rounds carries lessons that extend far beyond tank warfare. In any technical field, the newest technology isn't automatically the most effective in real-world applications. Reliability matters. Familiarity matters. Understanding your tools intimately enough to use them confidently under stress matters more than having access to the latest advancement. The operator's skill and confidence with a tool often matters more than the tool's theoretical maximum capability. American forces learned parallel lessons about ammunition effectiveness. The 76mm gun that armed later model Shermans could theoretically penetrate German heavy armor using specialized high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition designated HVAP. But American HVAP suffered from the same problems as British APDS: limited availability, accuracy issues at extended ranges, and unpredictable effects after penetration. American tank crews often preferred to use standard armor-piercing ammunition and maneuver for flank shots, rather than relying on HVAP for frontal penetrations. Tactical skill and positioning could overcome ammunition limitations. The Germans discovered similar lessons about their own ammunition. German armor-piercing rounds by late in the war contained almost no explosive filler, just 0.2% by weight in Panzergranate 39. German designers had eliminated the bursting charge to maximize penetration, creating ammunition that could defeat thick armor but sometimes failed to cause sufficient internal damage. German rounds that penetrated Soviet tanks occasionally passed completely through without disabling the vehicle, allowing damaged Soviet tanks to reverse to cover and escape. Soviet tankers learned to angle their T-34 seconds to encourage German rounds to pass through at shallow angles, minimizing the damage channel and keeping their tanks in action even after being penetrated. The engagement at Saint-Agnan-de-Cramesnil on August 8, 1944, demonstrates that combat effectiveness depends on the complete system: the weapon, the ammunition, the operator's training, the tactical situation, the terrain, the enemy's capabilities and limitations, and critically, the operator's ability to make correct decisions under life-threatening stress. Joe Ekins made the right choice that morning, not because he conducted a detailed analysis of ammunition performance characteristics, but because he understood his own capabilities and limitations. He chose ammunition he had confidence in, that would perform predictably, that he knew from training would do what he needed it to do. That confidence translated into accurate shooting when it mattered most. The Sherman Firefly continued in British and Commonwealth service well after World War II ended. Argentina purchased approximately 200 surplus Fireflies in 1947, and these tanks remained in Argentine service through the 1960s. The 17-pounder gun itself equipped various British vehicles through the 1950s, finally being replaced by the 84mm 20-pounder gun in the Centurion tank. But the Firefly's moment of greatest historical impact was in Normandy during summer 1944, when it gave British and Canadian armoured formations the ability to defeat German heavy tanks that had previously dominated armoured engagements. The ability to defeat German heavy tanks that had previously dominated armoured engagements. Battlefield equation changed. German tankers could no longer rely on armour superiority to protect them from Allied fire at combat ranges. The Firefly demonstrated that clever engineering could adapt existing platforms to mount more powerful weapons. that modification and adaptation could achieve results as effectively as designing new vehicles from scratch. The destruction of Michael Wittmann's Tiger symbolized this transformation. Nazi Germany's most celebrated tank ace, operating what was supposedly the most powerful tank in existence, had been destroyed by a first-time gunner in a modified American medium tank using standard British ammunition. The myth of Tiger invincibility died in that moment, killed not by revolutionary technology or overwhelming numbers, but by good tactics, sound engineering, and a young man who chose reliability over theoretical superiority. The ammunition that morning worked exactly as intended. APC-BC rounds flew true. They penetrated when they hit. They caused devastating internal damage. These straightforward characteristics, combined with a gunner who understood his weapon and a tactical situation that played to the Firefly's strengths, created one of the most significant single tank engagements of World War II. Joe Ekins fired 3 rounds that August morning. Each one destroyed a Tiger tank. No experimental ammunition with unpredictable performance. No theoretical calculations about maximum penetration at optimal angles. Just solid training, reliable ammunition, and the confidence to use what he knew would work. In the history of armored warfare, that combination proved more valuable than any amount of theoretical superiority. The perfect shot didn't require perfect ammunition. It required the right ammunition for the situation, delivered by someone who understood his weapon well enough to use it effectively when everything was on the line.